BBC News, hello, I'm Eileen McHugh. Israel is set to hold its fifth election in 3 years after the Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, said he would step down and hold a vote to dissolve Parliament next week. Another election is expected in the autumn. Our correspondent in Jerusalem, Tom Bateman, explains what finished the coalition.
It's lasted a year, but it has really been on its knees for the last few weeks or so. And the final moment, I think, that killed off the coalition was its inability to pass a law that usually goes pretty unnoticed in Israel, that every 5 years is a set of regulations that mean that Israeli law is applied to Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. The government was simply unable to pass what to it are critical laws, and so now there will be a dissolution of Parliament. And Mr Bennett, as is the coalition agreement, it seems, hands over to Yair Lapid, who will become Prime Minister until the next election.
Colombia's last recognisable rebel group, the National Liberation Army, or ELN, has said it's willing to resume peace talks with the government once the new president, Gustavo Petro, takes office in August. Our correspondent in Bogotá, Katie Watson, says the ELN's offer is significant.
They are now the kind of largest recognisable armed rebel group in Colombia. There are about 2,500 fighters. Now, it was just over 5 years ago that FARC, which was the much bigger leftist guerrilla group, signed a peace deal with the government. And that, for many, brought an end to the armed conflict that Colombia had seen for over 5 decades. It was seen as a real path forward and a new beginning for Colombia. But it was not signed with the ELN.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has told African leaders that Russia is responsible for the suffering of their people. He was addressing the African Union Assembly virtually. Anne Soy sent this report.
Mr Zelensky focused his message on food prices. He blamed Russia for disrupting supply chains. "We produce everything," he told African leaders, "so there's enough food for each of your countries." He said the manufacture of fertilizer has virtually stopped because of the threat of missile strikes, and then asked the Assembly, "Have you heard this from your Russian partners with whom you maintain contact?" The African Union Commission later said the body continues to call for dialogue, ceasefire, and the liberation of grains from the Odessa ports.
The Russian-occupied region of Crimea says Ukrainian forces have struck several offshore drilling platforms there in what would be the first such attack since Moscow's invasion. A member of the Russian-installed administration said 3 people had been injured in the attacks and that 7 other workers were missing. The Ukrainian military says Russia later carried out a missile attack that destroyed a food warehouse in the western port of Odessa. World News from the BBC. A former senior United Nations official is calling for an independent panel to investigate allegations of sexual abuse and corruption in the organisation. Purna Sen, who was in charge of tackling sexual harassment at the UN until 2020, has said that an urgent inquiry is needed. Several former members of staff have made claims to the BBC about cover-ups after raising allegations, including that a senior official sexually harassed women, something he vehemently denies. Some have lost their jobs after speaking out. The UN has told the BBC that it has consistently emphasised a zero-tolerance approach to sexual harassment and abuse. It says it's an open window to any external review. The biggest strike on Britain's railways for more than 30 years is underway, with most of the network expected to be brought to a standstill. The walkouts over pay, pensions and conditions. Last-minute talks to resolve the issues failed, as Katie Austin explains.
Despite pretty lengthy negotiations, both sides in this dispute were clearly too far apart to be able to prevent the action going ahead this week. Both say they're open to further talks in future, but the reality right now is that we do look set to see a week of travel misery, with passengers told not to take the train unless absolutely necessary. And Network Rail has estimated this week could cost it up to £150 million in lost revenue and aborted works. And the possibility appears to remain there could be more strikes to come unless an agreement can be reached.
A floating restaurant that was a famous Hong Kong landmark has sunk days after it was towed away from the harbour where it operated for nearly 50 years. The Jumbo restaurant capsized in the South China Sea while on its way to an undisclosed location. The owners say it went down in deep water and will be extremely difficult to salvage. Nobody was hurt. BBC News.